Hello, everyone, and welcome to the California Department of Education's Literacy Knowledge Building video series. In this video, Dr. Marianne Wolf from the University of California, Los Angeles Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice will discuss the reading brain and dyslexia. She is the author of Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain, and most recently, Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in the Digital World. She has received the highest honors from dyslexia organizations and most recently has been elected to the Pontifical Academy of Science. Before we begin, let's go over a brief bit of background on the Literacy Knowledge video series. This is a series of videos on critical topics in literacy birth through grade 12. It was developed by the California Department of Education and experts in the state literacy team, and it is complementary to the work of the Federal Comprehensive Literacy State Development Grants. You can learn more about the CLSD grants by going to the California Department of Education's website and searching for CLSD. The purpose of this video series is to provide guidance and resources on critical topics in literacy, to support the work of the CLSD grants, and to build coherence between California's literacy guidance documents, standards, and frameworks, and how they all support literacy. A major objective of the Comprehensive Literacy State Development Grant is to bring coherence between California's guiding documents, some of which you see here, like the California Preschool Learning Foundations, the Infant Toddler Learning and Development Foundations, the Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities, the Dyslexia Guidelines, and the English Learner Roadmap Policy. Other content area standards and frameworks support literacy as well. The videos produced in this series will illustrate the connections between all of these documents and also explain how the documents themselves support literacy development for our students. Videos will be produced over the course of the CLSD grant period. To be informed when new videos are posted, join the CLSD listserv by sending a blank email to join-california-literacy-states-development-program at mlist.cde.ca.gov. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Marianne Wolf.
Greetings to all of you. What a pleasure it is to be able to participate in this wonderful series from the California Department of Education. Special thanks to Jennifer Howitter for all the organization that she does. Now my next slide will show you where I am coming from. I am at the UCLA Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice. And you can reach me at Marianne, M-A-R-Y-A-N-N-E, at mariannewolf.com, MARYANNEWOLF.com. And on the next slide that you will see, you have a sense of the mission of our center and all the work we are doing in collaboration with UCLA and California State University schools of education, where we have a collaborative now in the state of California to work together on a mission that we all share. And that is that literacy is a basic human right across all learners, all ages, all backgrounds, all zip codes. And our work is, in essence, an attempt to bring the knowledge that we have as a set of fields and bring them to bear on how children become deeply literate over their lifetime. And in the next slide that you will see, you have a sense of some of the goals that we have at the center. The first one is to use the study of the reading brain and dyslexia to help all children learn to read. Many people think that some of the research in cognitive neuroscience and linguistics, as it's translated into education, is largely about our neurodiverse learners. And it certainly has that as a root. But this research is used to help all children learn to read. And I hope these series of videos that we are sharing with you will help you understand that very basic principle. And we will always have a goal of understanding what connotes dyslexia. And in fact, I often use the term dyslexias to refer to the fact that dyslexia is not just one entity. And we'll have some special time in this series to talk about that from various perspectives. But one of the most important goals that we have is to predict the different forms that dyslexia and other reading challenges take before children fail. This is so important to us for every form of reason that has to do with learning: cognitive reasons, linguistic reasons, social reasons, emotional reasons. We want to be able to help children learn how to read and have the best chance at having intervention and instruction that matches their needs. So a very important goal is, how can we predict early on, before a child ever begins to read, what are the areas of challenge, and how can we help teachers learn through the science of reading how to take that information and make intervention that is tailored ever better, ever more specifically to the needs of every child. And on our next slide, you'll see that what we have is a combination of disciplines that go into the science of reading. And it's a term that's used by so many people in so many different ways. But from our standpoint, what we are doing is, especially at the UCLA Center, we're especially interested in applying the work on the reading brain and its impediments to education. So cognitive neuroscience is used to take our knowledge about how that brain ever came to be a reading brain and using that knowledge in the classroom. The next slide shows you yet another set of goals. And that is, how can we work with educators? How can we work in our schools of education? How can we work in our school districts? How can we work in individual schools so that there's a reciprocity between the research world and the world of education? So we are doing work with the Office of Special Education with my colleague Laura Reinhardt, whom you will be hearing in this series. And we are working with educators around Los Angeles and San Francisco as well. But we want to be able to have this connection between teacher and researcher. And I'm so grateful to this series because that gives us an opportunity to share some of this, but also to receive questions over time on how we can make research and application ever more connected. Now, the next slide is looking at what I'm going to talk about in this particular film. And even though it's a short effort, no more than 30 to 40 minutes, we want to give you a quick overview of how that brain ever learned to read, how this knowledge helps us understand reading development and dyslexia, how it can help us predict better, and to give more targeted intervention. So even though it's an introduction, I want to raise all those questions during our short time together. Why neuroscience education? My colleague from Paris, Stanislas Dehaene, said it better than I do, so I use a quote from him. Parents and educators must have a better understanding of what reading changes in a child's brain. I am convinced that increased knowledge of these circuits, the brain circuits, will greatly simplify the teacher's task. That's the underlying theme of this series for me. Now, it all begins with a very interesting statement that I need you to think about. The human brain was never born to read. We were born to do all these other things, but never read. Reading is an invention. It's a cultural entity. And that means there's no one circuit for reading. And it means that that circuit has to develop, has to connect the parts that do exist and make this circuit that becomes ever more elaborated over time. But it begins with processes from 0 to 5 that become the component parts. So if you look at this slide, you see one of the things that we do as a society is we're building up cognition, we're building up language, we're building up visual recognition of things like letters and letter patterns and words. And then by around 5, we're going to have the instruction by us to help make that circuit work together automatically. But before we move on, let's go to the next slide so that you see how interesting it is that we don't have just one circuit. The fact is that circuit, because it's not genetic, has to be formed by its environment. And what is so interesting, if you look at this slide, is how different the environment can be if you have different writing systems. English alphabet is different from the Chinese logosyllabary, which is different again from the syllabaries in Japanese. The brain circuit reflects the requirement of the writing system, but it also reflects how we teach. This is a really important point, because when we talk about how important it is to take knowledge about the reading brain into the classroom, it's to know that you as teachers, as educators, as policymakers, make a very big difference in how you teach. That is going to have, that your emphasis will have a reflection in how the circuit builds. And finally, and this will be a piece of another film, the medium itself changes. So print has certain emphases and digital screen reading has other emphases. And there are pros and cons for what is going on with so many of our children learning how to read, not in print, but in digital formats. And we'll talk about that another time. But it's important from the start when we talk about science to realize we are learning so much in this very difficult moment in time with COVID about screen reading and its effects. Now, the next slide goes into what it takes to build that circuit. And I can't emphasize enough that what we do between 0 and 5 makes a huge difference. And when I talk about 2 stories, I'm talking about the fact that many of our children do not have the same advantages in developing those component regions. Now remember, a circuit is built of components like language and cognition and visual recognition. And what happens in 0 to 5 is very important for building the parts that will be connected. The next slide looks at what we see when we have those, if you will, those 2 different stories. For those children who get rich language, who are read to every night, who are giving all this background about literacy in that 0 to 5 period, the rich get richer in terms of the language environment, and the poor get poorer. That was a phrase used, it was called the Matthew effect by Keith Stanovich years ago, and it holds true today. Those who have the richest of language environments, that's reflected in the components for concept, for language, for affect, for recognition. The children who do not receive this do not have the same starting place in kindergarten. So we really have to take that 0 to 5 period extremely seriously. Now, what are the things that we can and should be doing? One of the things is to be sure that the children are learning the words and whatever that first language is. And so much of the California Department of Education, some of the materials are so good because they emphasize what is going on in our early our early childhood periods with children who are bilingual or multilingual. We have to ensure they are representing the words of their first language. That is the foundation. But at the same time, as the children who are English language learners, they must be assured by kindergarten that they're also representing the phonemes of the language they will read, which is English. So one of the things that's really important to understand is that whatever the first language is, that provides that background for the meanings of words, how words are used syntactically. And we're also emphasizing making sure that children are able to have understanding of print, the orthography of the language. So all of these things are going to contribute to the circuit at 5. And we, between 0 and 5, are building them up. Every word is attached to a concept. In fact, many of our words are attached to multiple concepts. It's all building that brain. The phonemes are one of the areas of research we have done so much work on in the last 40 years. And what I need always to emphasize in any talk on the science of reading is that when we ultimately are putting the circuit parts together, the phonemes of that language have to be represented so they can be connected to the graphic elements, the letters. So letter sound correspondence rules is absolutely essential in that building of the circuit connections, but it rests on making sure the phonemes of that language are represented as well as the letters themselves. So when you think of what goes on when parents read to their children, they are getting a concept of print, but they're also getting concepts of meaning. What are the meanings of words? Every book that a child is read to is building like a geometric progression, the foundation for understanding what words mean. Connie Jewell said this so beautifully. One of the great mistakes in the teaching of reading is to assume that if a child decodes the word, they know it. We, in the 0 to 5 period, and throughout our educational system, have to understand how important the meanings of words are. One of the saddest slides that I've shown 1,000 times is to illustrate the two childhoods, the two stories. And here you see data that many of you seen before. There's brand new data that's in brain imaging that replicates it and even goes deeper by John Gabrielli's lab at MIT. But basically this old data holds true. There is a gap of millions of words heard by children who have a less rich language environment than those who have a rich language environment. It is a huge gap, and that's what we must prevent. The work by my colleagues at MIT have looked also at the qualitative dimensions of what is going on. So it's not just how many words a child has heard, but the elaboration, how words are being used. And my colleague Catherine Hirsch-Pasek and John Gabrielli have shown so much about how essential parent interaction, caretaker interaction is around early languages development. The emphasis on that 0 to 5 period is also involving what is happening in multiple areas of the brain. The more we work in those sensitive periods to be developing these component parts, the more, if you will, bang for the buck, this is an economic term, in terms of return of investment. So what we do in 0 to 5 helps every other developmental epoch. And that's why economists have a role to play when we talk about the science of reading. I can talk about how important it is to have this brain development happening, but there are economic aspects. And so Heckman from the University of Chicago has done all of this research to show that the greatest return of investment, what they call the bang for the buck, is when we are investing in that early childhood period and making sure those components are developing. So one of the ways that we can do this is to work with our pediatricians, like the Reach Out and Read group. And what they are doing in many ways is to show through brain imaging, and just the simple act of giving at well visits books to parents to read literally helps activate those language regions more for those who are being read to. And here you simply see an arrow pointing out these areas in the brain, the receptive areas of language and the expressive, are more activated when children are being read to. And that's just some of the more beautiful images. Now, one of the things that we also know in dyslexia is that the more children are read to early on, even though they're going to become dyslexic later, and there's very interesting research on that, they are doing better when we look back retrospectively if they have been read to more and more by their parents. So that's a lovely little anecdote. Now, when it all starts to come together, we have a decoding brain. Now, I have been too slow with you to give you all this information, but I wanted to insist that you realize we are building that circuit. And then we teachers are helping to connect the parts and elaborate them so that those foundational skills that are essential for us to teach first, those are those first 5 parts of that brain. We are connecting the phonemes and the graphemes, the letters and the sounds, and we're connecting that to the meanings of the words and how the words are used and how the words are in sentences and in stories. What we are building is a systematically connected reading brain. Now, this is not about one approach versus another. In essence, what we are doing is saying the foundational skills, those early decoding skills, are absolutely necessary. Phonemes, semantics, graphemes, all of that, morphology, all that is essential. But at the same time, developing the meanings and how words work in stories. And that becomes the basis of what I am calling deep reading. Now, comprehension is what most people are thinking about when they're thinking about understanding. But what I am asking people to realize is that deep reading is what we elaborate after those foundational skills get all hooked up. We are elaborating very incredibly sophisticated processes. We are putting all that background knowledge, we're making analogies between it and what's new on the page. We are developing what I would call background knowledge or conceptual knowledge with everything the child is reading. So if you think about it, it's like a spiral. It's all building upon each other. And as that knowledge is becoming the basis of the next thing we read and the next thing we read, beautiful, sophisticated processes start accruing and being added to the circuit. One of the most essential aspects of what we do when we read to our child and when a child begins to read for themselves is that they leave their egocentric, their Piaget egocentric self behind and take on the perspective of others. This is one of the most beautiful aspects of reading. It's about empathy and perspective taking. And that's being connected, those affective processes. In addition, one of the things that we see is that this empathy that we are building is actually a part of what will ultimately make citizens. Now, this is something that most people don't think about when they're thinking about what we're doing when we're reading. We are providing a basis for taking on the perspective of others. And Barack Obama and Marilynne Robinson, my favorite novelist, said this, that the novel, the story, gives a chance to the child and the adult to leave the self behind and recognize others. Marilynne Robinson said, the trend towards seeing those different as sinister other is the greatest danger to continuing our democracy. The last thing people think about when they're teaching reading is that they are making citizens, but we are making critically analytic, empathic citizens. And that's part of the science as well. Here you see some interesting pictures of what you're doing with empathy. And it's not just about feeling, it's also about building a theory of another's mind. Now, if we think about how we put all these together for the ultimate two goals of reading, it's to combine what we know with what we infer, we deduce facts, and then we build hypotheses to evaluate. This can't be more important in this moment when so many people are susceptible to fake and false news. We are reading critically when we give the time to it, and children have to learn to do that. So one of the most important parts of deep reading is to realize that critical analysis is learning to discern the truth value, to test. And that's what the brain does. It goes back and forth, evaluating hypotheses and figuring out, is this true? We must develop those skills in the deep reading, as well as empathy for our next citizens. I actually love Miss Marple, whom many of you don't know who she is. But when I think about the deep reading brain, I think of a combination of Sherlock Holmes, who can deduce all these facts and put them all together. But Miss Marple adds motivation and empathy. So you'll see that the beauty of all this, and that's Thomas Aquinas for those of you who might want to know who that is. The beauty is that this deep reading brain is putting those foundational skills, making them automatic and connected, ever more elaborated with the beauty of the deep reading processes. Now, what we see from all our research is that there are two things happening. We need years to form that deep reading brain, but after it is made, we need to be sure that we are giving those milliseconds, and that's a piece of the story with the digital brain that's for later. But what we are doing is building this deep reading brain, and it is never a given. Now, in the next few minutes, I'm going to very briefly end with several slides about dyslexia, in which we see that dyslexia represents a different organization of the brain, one that's necessary, one that we absolutely have gotten through evolution. In fact, the dyslexic brain was there before we ever learned to read, only 6,000 years ago. But it represents part of the cerebral diversity that we need as human beings. We need different kinds of organizations. If you look at the next slide, you're going to see why. We have some of the most interesting inventors, entrepreneurs, and artists around the world and around our historical epochs that contribute differently because they have that different brain organization. And here you see in California, Charles Schwab, and you have Tesla. So we've got two California related people here. But you also have at the bottom, Ben Wolf Noam. And that's one of your wonderful LA artists that you don't even know about yet, but you should. He's also my son, which has given me some particular insights into reading. Now, I'm going to just very quickly just say that part of my interest in dyslexia and artistry came out of studying Leonardo da Vinci for the Smithsonian, that we did a film for them. And one of the most interesting things that I discovered in this remarkable artist's life is that he represents some of the greatest strengths and the weaknesses in dyslexia. And if there's anyone who thinks outside the box, it was Leonardo da Vinci. He's the apex of that strength, but he also had interesting weaknesses that we see in dyslexia. And one of them is word retrieval. One of them is being very usually interestingly good in geometry and interestingly weak in algebra. But the real point of this is simply that there's this great mix of strengths and weaknesses that you see in dyslexia that go well outside what we think about as just a problem learning to read. It's a different organization of the brain. If you look at modernity, we have actually done a study or work with a foundation with entrepreneurs, and we find some of the exact same strengths and weaknesses in some of our most extraordinary entrepreneurs today. And there's about 30 to 35% of the entrepreneurs today have a history of dyslexia. So this is never, ever give up on our children. I'm going to end now. This is a brief preview of what I would like to call the many faces of the science of reading. I will just look forward to speaking to you in 2 other small videos. This one is the longest one, but I want to end by saying the science of reading is a way of bringing knowledge that is ever ongoing and becoming ever more elaborated through multiple disciplines, so that our end goal of teaching our future teachers and our present teachers like you, how this knowledge base can enhance our ability to predict early, and this will be in our dyslexia field, to predict early and give ever more differentiated intervention that is systematic, explicit, evidence-based, and leading to the deep reading which we need so much to create for our next generation of citizens. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you, like I, feel that the science of reading is part poetry and part democracy. Thanks again.
Thank you for viewing The Reading Brain and Dyslexia, What It Teaches Us for All of Our Children. Access the discussion questions to deepen your learning with your colleagues. And make sure to watch the next video in the series, the Dyslexia Guidelines Overview. Thanks.